We start this news hour in China, where the leader credited with steering the country to global power has died. Former President Jiang Zemin was 96. He came to office just after the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and crackdown. He's seen as one of the architects of China's transformation into a market economy. Katrina Yu looks back on his life.
Rare among Chinese leaders, Jiang Zemin seemed to enjoy the spotlight. He stepped into the top job during a turbulent period. He was appointed Communist Party General Secretary in June 1989, following the military crackdown on student-led protests in Tiananmen Square. His predecessor, Zhao Ziyang, had been removed from power for openly sympathizing with the demonstrators. Jiang was the former mayor of Shanghai, a city then at the forefront of ambitious economic reforms, slowly spreading across the country. Those reforms would eventually allow China to grow into the world's second-largest economy, and Shanghai into a global financial hub. Although China presents itself as a communist country, an increasing number of party members are becoming millionaires, and some billionaires. As economic growth surged under Jiang, foreign investment poured in. In 1997, patriotic pride soared when Britain returned Hong Kong. In 1999, Jiang initiated a ruthless campaign against the spiritual practice of Falun Gong. Human rights groups said hundreds of thousands of people were imprisoned or sent to labor camps. Under his rule, China became a member of the World Trade Organization and was also awarded the 2008 Olympics. But some things remained unchanged. The leadership continued to crack down on dissent. China's marketization of its centrally planned economy brought dangers. The gap between rich and poor widened, and corruption worsened. A legacy Jiang's successor, Hu Jintao, inherited in 2002. In Chinese history, only Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and the current president, Xi Jinping, loom larger than Jiang. It remains to be seen whether he will receive the same reverence as China builds its position on the global stage.
Well, Katrina Yu joins us live from Beijing now. And Katrina, can you tell us more about his legacy and what the reaction has been so far there?
Well, state media just informed the public of his passing this afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, expressing profound grief over his death, saying that he was a great revolutionary and a long-tested communist fighter. So they're really upping his Communist Party credentials when they talk about him. But he's remembered among the people as so much more. He couldn't have been any more different to the rather straight-faced or serious officials that we often see in China today. It's certainly very, very different to China's current leader, Xi Jinping, who's sort of portrayed as an emperor. Jiang Zemin, by contrast, was seen as more of an everyman. He had his characteristic thick, heavy-set black glasses, and he often spoke quite candidly and quite frequently to the press. He used English quite often. He even gave entire speeches in English. He was fond of, for example, singing Italian songs in front of foreign dignitaries, and it was well known that he played the piano and would often make jokes when speaking publicly. That's not to say he was not a serious leader, though. During his 13 years of ruling China, China essentially transformed into somewhat of a pariah state after the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown into a global superpower. He implemented many economic reforms that had been instigated by his predecessor, Deng Xiaoping, which saw China open up more, became more of a globalized country than it had ever been before. He also oversaw China's joining of the World Trade Organization in 2001, and of course also the handover of Hong Kong back to mainland China in 1997. Now, all of that is not to say that he wasn't a tough or by any means a progressive leader. He also oversaw a crackdown, as we just heard, over the spiritual movement Falun Gong, and also repressed many protests in the countryside by farmers because of some of his reforms. And at the same time, he carried out a very coercive sort of approach towards Taiwan. And while he was in power, China also saw a lot of corruption flourish throughout many of its officials.
OK, Katrina Yu, thank you very much for that. Well, Victor Gauls, the Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalisation, he is also in Beijing and joins us now live. Thank you very much for being on Al Jazeera. Now, I understand you knew him personally. We heard from Katrina there that he was incredibly charismatic. What were some of the other attributes that made him a great leader?
We are all very sorry for the loss of former Party Secretary General Jiang Zemin today. I knew him personally in the 1980s. I even traveled on the same special plane seated next to him for a travel of more than 2 hours. So I know him personally. And I think his legacy is a very great legacy because he was the top leader of China for about 13 years. And then his influence actually reached into the fourth generation and until very recently is very much revered and respected in China, and his leadership of China really oversaw China overcoming the very difficult, challenging times in the early 1990s and normalizing the relations with the United States and the West at large, and also joining WTO, for example, which paved the way for the subsequent rapid economic transformation of China. And Mr. Jiang Zemin was also a very humane figure. He knows many languages, foreign languages, as well as domestic Chinese dialects, for example. He's very sophisticated and very cosmopolitan. And he knows where he wants to lead China. And he has left a very deep fingerprint on the political system in China, on the Chinese military, as well as on how China need to open up and continue economic and political reforms. It's a great loss to the Chinese nation. And I think that the mourning for his passing away and his legacy will be really very much memorialized in the coming few days.
OK. He came to power after the Tiananmen Square protests. Can you explain what the country was like then and the hurdles that he had to overcome at that time?
I would say Mr. Jiang Zemin became the Party Secretary General, the President of the People's Republic of China, and eventually the Chairman of the Central Military Commission, more or less by accident. In 1989, he was about to retire. He was, of course, a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, of course. However, I think what happened in 1989 really brought the positions and opportunities to him because he was really very well qualified at that critical moment. And the subsequent years of his leadership also proved that this decision was a correct decision for the Chinese Communist Party, for the military, and for the whole nation as a whole. And I would say his sophistication, his knowledge base, his knowledge about China versus the rest of the world, and the fact that he was actually based in the former Soviet Union in the 1950s and also worked for a while in Romania, for example, also broadened his view about the outside of China. And eventually, the fact that he was very much involved in the leadership of China's opening up to the outside world, foreign trade, machinery building, for example, and also leading the great city of Shanghai, paved the way and created all the credentials for him to eventually be promoted to the top position in China. And I think the human side is also very important for his leadership. And during his leadership, China was really a very happy period of time. Everyone was improving their living standards, and China's relations with the rest of the world, especially with the Western countries, were improved significantly.
Just on that, you describe him as a very significant man, but his government also stamped out dissent, jailed human rights and pro-democracy activists. That is also part of his legacy, isn't it?
Well, I would say either in the 1990s or in the 21st century or even now, maintaining stability in China has always been the most important overriding task. Without stability, we cannot afford to really significantly improve our economic situation and thus improving the living standards of the people. Therefore, maintaining stability and fighting against any reason or any forces which would deprive China of stability has been a constant challenge for China. And I think the former leader, Jiang Zemin, did a good job in maintaining stability, paving the way for China's reconnection with the rest of the world. And eventually, the whole Chinese people really benefited from his wisdom, his dedication, his sophistication, his cosmopolitanism, for example, and his eagerness to push for greater opening of China to the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us on Al Jazeera. That is Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalisation. Thank you.